For over 4 centuries, it has been safeguarded inside the Cathedral of Turin, protected behind a bulletproof glass case, the most studied artifact in human history, a linen cloth that since its appearance has challenged historians, theologians, and scientists alike. An old fabric of uncertain origin, worn by the relentless passage of time, covered in strange markings, yet it has become one of Catholicism's most revered relics. An object of veneration, as it is considered the only physical evidence of the man whose legacy has shaped the course of civilization. In that airtight glass case, deprived of oxygen and filled with an inert gas, rests what has been called the Holy Shroud. To millions of believers, it is the burial cloth that covered the body of Jesus Christ after the crucifixion, preserving an imperishable imprint. The face of the Son of God. Since the first historical record of its existence in the 14th century, the Shroud of Turin has been enshrined as an enigmatic artifact, a sheet on which the image of a man appears to be imprinted, a man many have claimed to be the Messiah. For centuries, every attempt to unravel its origins led to dead ends. Scientific investigations failed time and again to provide definitive answers, reinforcing narratives that treated the shroud as undeniable proof of Jesus Christ's resurrection. For better or worse, that veil of uncertainty seemed to lift in the late 1980s when radiocarbon dating tests confirmed that the shroud dated more than 12 centuries after Christ's death. It could not be the cloth that covered his body, a discovery that validated the skeptics. For over 30 years, the academic consensus held that the Holy Shroud was nothing more than an ingenious medieval forgery, a deception crafted over 1,200 years after the crucifixion described in the Gospels. But against all odds, just when we thought the case was closed, the myth of the Shroud of Turin resurfaced one last time. In 2024, the Holy Shroud once again made headlines worldwide due to a controversial article published 2 years earlier in a low-impact scientific journal, which had initially gone unnoticed until the democracy of social media catapulted it to fame. A team of Italian scientists from the Institute of Crystallography in Bari, led by researcher Liberato De Caro, published a study reigniting the debate over the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. Using an advanced X-ray scattering technique, they analyzed the cellulose structure of the shroud's linen fibers to determine its age based on its degradation. The radiocarbon tests conducted in the 1980s had dated the shroud to between the 13th and 14th centuries, seemingly putting an end to all speculation. But the findings of the Italian researchers suggested that the fabric could be approximately 2,000 years old, placing it in the time of Jesus Christ and making it plausible that this was the burial shroud that covered his body. The scientists themselves admitted in the article that the technique was only reliable if the analyzed fabric had remained in a controlled environment throughout its existence, with a temperature between 20 and 22.5 degrees Celsius and humidity between 55% and 75%. They were assuming that this shroud, which had survived multiple fires in the chapels where it had been kept, had been preserved under perfect conditions for over 2,000 years. In fact, even assuming this impossibility, the X-ray dating technique they used had only been corroborated in one other study, coincidentally published in the same journal and conducted by the exact same team of scientists who authored this article. Still, 2 years after its publication, the research findings were spreading indiscriminately across social media and international news outlets. The debate over the authenticity of the Holy Shroud had been fully reignited. The world of faith was clinging to it as validation of what could be the most important sacred relic in history, the only real image of Christ and proof of his resurrection. The story of the Holy Shroud emerges from the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. On the eve of his death, in what is described as the year 33, Jesus of Nazareth gathered with his disciples for the Last Supper. He shared bread and wine, symbolizing his body and blood, and spoke of his imminent sacrifice. He announced that one of them would betray him, leaving the apostles in disbelief. But that very night, Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, handed him over to the soldiers with a kiss. Arrested and brought before the religious leaders, Jesus was accused of blasphemy and handed over to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, who sentenced the King of the Jews to die by crucifixion. Flogged, crowned with thorns, and forced to carry his cross to Golgotha, Jesus faced crucifixion. The sky darkened, and after hours of agony, he took his final breath. The earth trembled. The Son of God had died. A sacrifice that restored peace between the Lord and humanity. After his death, Joseph of Arimathea requested his body and along with Nicodemus prepared it for burial. Jesus was embalmed according to Jewish tradition, anointed with a mixture of myrrh and aloe, wrapped in linen, and placed in a tomb. A large stone was set at the entrance. The Roman guards sealed it. It seemed like the end. Saturday passed in oppressive silence. But on Sunday before dawn, a group of women went to the tomb to anoint the body. Upon arrival, they found the stone removed. The tomb was empty. Through the resurrection, Christ had conquered death, fulfilling the promises he had made during his life. When the news reached his disciples, Peter and John ran to the tomb. It was not empty. Something remained. The cloth that had wrapped the body. The only legacy of the death and resurrection of the Son of God. The Holy Shroud is not mentioned again in the Gospels. Its fate after being removed from the tomb remains a mystery. It does not reappear in any documents or historical records for over 1,000 years, until the mid-14th century, when a prominent French knight provides the first historical record of the relic. In 1355, Geoffroi de Charny displayed a shroud in a church in Lirey, France, which he had acquired during the Crusades in the Holy Land. According to medieval chronicles, the knight presented it as an object of devotion, claiming it was the burial cloth that had covered Christ before and during his resurrection. This marked the starting point of the documented history of its existence in Europe. A 4.4 meter long by 1 meter wide sheet containing the image of a tortured man, displaying both his front and back, a depiction of Christ's face imprinted on the fabric. The shroud bore a significant number of bloodstains in areas consistent with crucifixion, including wounds on the head resembling those that might have been inflicted by a crown of thorns. On the back, there were signs of repeated scourging. Such was the belief in its sacred origin that a year after its exhibition, in 1356, Pope Innocent VI issued a letter recognizing the public veneration of what became known as the Shroud of Lirey, giving a significant boost to its spread and establishing it as an object of religious devotion in the Middle Ages. The shroud remained in the possession of the Charny family for a century, until in 1453, Geoffrey's granddaughter sold it to the court of the Dukes of Savoy, one of the most powerful families in Europe. Under their care, the shroud was transferred to Chambéry Castle, in what is now France, safeguarded in its royal chapel inside a silver chest. With the Vatican's approval, pilgrimages to the castle became frequent, until the shroud came dangerously close to disappearing forever. On the night of December 3rd, 1532, a devastating fire broke out in Chambéry Castle, affecting the chapel where the shroud was kept. The flames damaged the silver chest in which it rested, yet miraculously it survived. Though not entirely consumed, it suffered significant damage. Holes caused by the fire and water stains from desperate efforts to extinguish the blaze. In the aftermath of the disaster, the congregation of Poor Clare nuns in Chambéry restored the shroud, using sewing techniques to cover the damaged areas with linen patches placed over the original fabric. a rudimentary effort that ensured its preservation for future generations, unknowingly preventing speculation about its origins from ever being fully resolved. Following the fire, the House of Savoy decided to transfer the shroud to Turin for better preservation. Thus, in 1578, the relic was brought to what, 4 centuries later, remains its resting place, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. The shroud was stored in the Royal Chapel, specifically built to house it, a protected location, out of public reach. For nearly 300 years, no one outside a select group of individuals was able to see it. It was not until 1842 that Pope Gregory XVI authorized the first public exhibition of the shroud in Turin, an event that caused a great stir among believers and the curious alike. After a long period of silence that had caused the relic's memory and significance to fade, interest in what was already known in Italy as the Shroud of Turin began to grow with each rare display. Everything was leading to a turning point. The moment when the shroud would gain international fame, and the eyes of the world would fall upon the lifeless gaze imprinted upon it. For a long time, the existence of the Holy Shroud was known only within certain niches of the Italian Catholic faith. Science and the general public remained largely unaware of the historical relevance of this relic preserved in Turin. But everything changed with the first photograph of the shroud. In 1898, the House of Savoy granted permission to Secondo Pia, an Italian lawyer and amateur photographer, to take the first photographs of the shroud. During the process, he used long exposure techniques that would reveal to the world the intricate details of this mysterious sacred relic. The great discovery came when he developed the photographs and noticed that the negative, where colors and tones were reversed compared to reality, was a clearer and more detailed image than what was visible to the naked eye. The features of the man's face and body on the shroud became more distinct, more defined. A reality invisible to the human eye. It was as if the image on the shroud itself was a negative, and with this revelation, what we called a photographic negative was in fact showing the positive. The wounds and facial features were so detailed that it appeared to be a portrait of the person wrapped in the cloth. A visual confirmation of many of the details described in the Bible about the crucifixion of Christ. Following the publication of Secondo Pia's photographs, the Shroud of Turin rapidly gained worldwide fame. Millions were fascinated by the details imprinted on the cloth, and the debate between scientists and theologians over whether the image was a true portrait of the historical Jesus erupted. At the same time, skeptics also began questioning the authenticity of the shroud, using Pia's images to argue that it must be an artistic creation, that what we saw on the fabric was merely paint, the result of medieval manipulation. Suddenly, the Holy Shroud had become the most controversial, enigmatic, and intriguing of all sacred relics. This intensified in 1931 when Giuseppe Henri photographed the shroud, and his negatives revealed the exact same details as Pia's. Despite decades of doubt over whether Pia had manipulated the images, it became clear that he had not lied. The negatives were real. In the years and decades that followed, scientific and theological interest in the shroud grew, culminating in 1973 when the first color television broadcast of the Holy Shroud took place. Millions around the world saw, in full splendor, a relic still shrouded in mystery, a veil of shadows that had yet to be lifted. On October 8, 1978, with the approval of the Catholic Church and the then custodian of the shroud, more than 600 years after its first appearance, a team of researchers was granted permission to conduct the first scientific analysis of the Holy Shroud. Dubbed the Shroud of Turin Research Project, its goal was to analyze the cloth with the most advanced technology of the time to determine how the image had formed and, most importantly, whether there was any evidence of forgery. The team, composed of 40 scientists from various disciplines, including physicists, chemists, microbiologists, and forensic analysts, traveled to the Cathedral of Turin, where they were given 120 hours to study the shroud. No one in history had ever had such access to the relic, and most likely, no one ever would again. They took photographs in visible, infrared, and ultraviolet light to examine the image's details. Through a device called VP8, they confirmed that the image contained three-dimensional information, something that does not occur with conventional paintings or photographs. They conducted X-ray radiographs to detect chemical elements or artificial pigments on the linen. Spectroscopy and fluorescence analysis were used to study the properties of the image. The linen fibers were examined under microscopes to check for traces of paint. Bloodstains were analyzed with hematological tests to determine whether they were real human blood. It was the most exhaustive scientific study ever conducted on a single object. Everyone assumed it would put an end to all debates. But when in 1981, after 2 years of analyzing the collected data, the researchers published their conclusions, the mystery surrounding the shroud was more alive than ever. The findings fueled all sorts of speculation. They could confirm that the image had not been created with any known paint, ink, or pigment. They found no visible brush strokes or traces under the microscope. It appeared instead to be caused by surface dehydration and oxidation of the fibers, as if the linen had been scorched in a way they could not explain, without penetrating deep into the fabric. Moreover, pollen from Gondelia tournefortii, a thorny plant that grows exclusively in the Jerusalem region and had previously been linked to the crown of thorns described in the Gospels, was found embedded in the fibers. The red stains were, in fact, compatible with type AB human blood, with exceptionally high levels of bilirubin, suggesting that the person wrapped in the shroud had suffered severe trauma, possibly prolonged torture. Using ultraviolet light imaging, they discovered traces of blood serum that had remained invisible until their fluorescence was stimulated. Either a medieval artist had predicted the invention of UV fluorescence techniques 700 years in advance, or that blood was real. With all the technology of the time at their disposal, they did not find a single sign of medieval forgery and could not explain how the image was formed. The research delivered a clear verdict. There is no known natural or artificial mechanism that can replicate the effect seen on the Shroud of Turin. The team demonstrated that the cloth was neither a painting nor an obvious forgery, but they also could not prove it was authentic. Everything remained in a strange limbo that generated even more interest in the relic. Many critics argued that several team members held Christian beliefs that might have influenced their approach. The world wanted clear answers, irrefutable evidence that would put an end to the debate, and all roads led to the same place, determining the age of the shroud. An ambition that would take years to materialize due to the high cost it required. Before his death in March 1983, Umberto II of Savoy, the last king of Italy and the legitimate owner of the shroud, bequeathed it to the Pope through his will, specifying that the shroud should always remain under the custody of the Supreme Pontiff. From then on, the Vatican would be the sole legal guardian of the Holy Shroud. The Pope would decide on its preservation, exhibition, and scientific studies. And against all odds, in a historic decision, John Paul II granted permission for the definitive analysis of the shroud. The Church authorized the radiocarbon dating of the shroud to determine its true age, allowing researchers to remove a small fragment, a 7 by 1 centimeters piece from the damaged lower left corner, and send the samples to 3 independent laboratories: the University of Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. These institutions would perform carbon-14 dating on it, a method that uses the radioactive isotope of carbon to determine the age of living tissues. All organisms absorb this unstable radiocarbon while alive, but it gradually decays over time. When an organism dies, the exchange stops, and carbon-14 begins to decay into nitrogen at a constant rate, a process known as radioactive decay. Knowing that the isotope's half-life is 5,730 years, meaning that after this period, half of the radiocarbon in a material has disintegrated, by measuring the remaining amount in a sample, one can calculate how much time has passed since it stopped absorbing carbon. Or in other words, when that organism died. The Holy Shroud was made of linen, a fiber obtained from a plant, a living organism. If scientists measured how much carbon-14 remained in the fabric, they could determine when that linen was cut, and therefore the age of the venerated relic. When the radiocarbon dating was conducted, all 3 laboratories obtained similar dates. With a 95% degree of certainty, they could state that the shroud dated to sometime between 1260 and 1390 AD, a time frame that included the year Geoffroi de Charny presented it after allegedly rescuing it from the Holy Land. The shroud was crafted in the Middle Ages. It could not have been the burial cloth that covered Christ's body. The results made headlines in media outlets worldwide. It was a scientific fact that the Shroud of Turin could not be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, who had supposedly died 13 centuries before the fabric was woven. The story seemed to end there. Radiocarbon dating was understandably considered definitive proof of its falseness. But more than 3 decades later, even if through an article that lacked solid grounding, the myth had been reborn, and there were still many unanswered questions. The origin of the shroud could be resolved through radiocarbon dating, but what no one had ever been able to explain was what truly made this shroud a revered relic: the image of a man imprinted on it. The face and body of that person remained a mystery. The darkened and discolored regions on the fabric that form the image exist only on the very topmost layer of the linen fibers, penetrating just 0.2 micrometers in depth. They are not present in the middle or underneath the fabric, something already extremely unusual. If the body of that man had been covered by the cloth and left an imprint, the discoloration should be visible on the lower part where it was actually in contact with the corpse. This, along with the radiocarbon dating, reinforced the idea that it was all a fraud, a medieval forgery. The sudden appearance of the shroud in the mid-14th century coincided with a historical period in which sacred relics were surrounded by powerful conflicts of interest. Because relics were a source of wealth, people paid money to see them, to touch them. The wealthy donated large sums for their protection and conservation. Hundreds of churches across Europe displayed artifacts that they claimed were connected to Christ. When de Charny presented the shroud in 1355, it was immediately exhibited in his church in Lirey, turning it into a renowned sight in the region and attracting dozens of pilgrims eager to be near the cloth that displayed the face of the Messiah. And even at that time, someone doubted its authenticity. In 1389, Pierre d'Arcy, the Bishop of Laon in France, wrote a letter to Pope Clement VII denouncing that the Holy Shroud of Lirey was fake. That shroud had never covered the body of Jesus. It was a fraud created by an artist so that de Charny could profit from it. Despite the allegations, the Pope never directly intervened in the matter nor took an official stance on its authenticity. In fact, he urged D'Arcis to stop discussing the issue under threat of excommunication. According to the bishop, the image on the shroud was not the result of a miracle. It was the work of a painter who had imprinted the image onto the fabric. The carbon-14 dating supported the idea of forgery, but there was a fundamental problem with that explanation. We know precisely which pigments medieval painters used, and as had already been demonstrated by the 1978 project, no traces of any dye or substance used in medieval painting were found on the shroud. At a time when fake relics did not need to be sophisticated, in an era when few questioned what they saw, why would someone create such a complex forgery, capable of deceiving the science that would arrive 600 years later? It was clear that the simplest answer, that it was a painting, could not resolve the enigma. But if they were to defend the idea of forgery, they needed to find a conclusive explanation for how the image appeared on the cloth without a single drop of paint touching it. And there seemed to be only one answer, that the image on the Holy Shroud had been created through a primitive photographic process, long before the invention of modern photography. The hypothesis suggested that a real body might have been illuminated and projected onto a canvas, in this case the linen shroud, treated with photosensitive substances inside a dark space, something known in the medieval era as a camera obscura. The light reflected by the body would pass through a small hole in the room, projecting an inverted image onto the shroud on the opposite wall, a sort of natural projector. For the image to be imprinted on the fabric, it would have needed to be coated with a light-sensitive substance, likely silver nitrate. By being exposed to reflected light for hours or days, the image would technically have been imprinted on the cloth like a photographic negative, which would explain why, when Secondo Pia developed his photographs, the negative appeared to be the positive, revealing more details than the original image. Nonetheless, although camera obscuras existed, there was no evidence that people in the Middle Ages knew how to treat fabrics with photosensitive substances. There were also no distortions in the image, something that would be expected if a three-dimensional body had indeed been projected onto a flat surface. Furthermore, no other example of this method has been found in history. Doubts about this hypothesis became definitive when a reanalysis of the chemical data from the 1978 project showed that no traces of silver salts were found in the linen of the shroud. If there were no photosensitive substances, it would have been impossible for a forger to have imprinted the image onto the cloth. If it was neither a painting nor a primitive photograph, the forgery theory began to crumble. If nothing explained how such a fraud had been executed, perhaps it was because there had never been a fraud. Taking both the radiocarbon dating and the authenticity of the shroud as real, a new theory began to emerge. Perhaps the image on the shroud was evidence of a crucifixion, but not of the figure we thought. Maybe that shroud had not covered the body of Christ, but rather that of the last of the Templar masters. In the 14th century, the Order of the Knights Templar, originally created to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, had become a tremendously powerful and influential organization, a threat to the Church's authority. Claiming that the Templars were heretics who did not practice the faith correctly, on October 13, 1307, King Philip IV of France, with the approval of Pope Clement V, ordered the dissolution of the order, leading to the arrest of the then Grand Master of the Templars, the Knight Jacques de Molay. The cruelty of the French Inquisition targeted the nobleman, who, accused of heresy and blasphemy, was condemned to crucifixion. Not as an execution, but as a method of extracting a confession about the alleged heretical practices within the order. After obtaining his confession, the Inquisition had one final humiliation in store for the knight. De Molay was embalmed alive in a shroud and left abandoned for 24 hours. After that ordeal, he survived and lived for another 7 years before being executed by burning at the stake for recanting his confession. There are accounts of a knight named Jean who took his master's torture shroud and kept it as a symbol of the Templar struggle. Curiously, this Jean was the grandfather of Geoffroi de Charny, who, less than 50 years after de Molay's torture, introduced the Shroud of Turin to the world. The date, 1307, fell within the range determined by radiocarbon dating, which placed the shroud's creation between 1260 and 1390. However, this was all based on speculation, unsupported by historical records, and even if the theory of a Templar connection were true, the formation of the image remained inexplicable. It was even possible that the established dating paradigm of the shroud needed to be rewritten. Perhaps the radiocarbon dating results were incorrect. The 1988 analysis determined that the linen of the shroud dated between 1260 and 1390 AD, but for the dating to be reliable, the sample could not have been contaminated with newer carbon-14, and here is where speculation resurfaced. To date the shroud, researchers cut a fabric sample from a corner that might not have been representative of the original cloth. That edge was visibly damaged, suggesting that it could contain fibers from a medieval restoration following the fire. The shroud survived in 1532. When the congregation of nuns repaired the shroud, they introduced new threads from the 16th century, which could have caused the dating results to be a midpoint between that era and the 1st century. Furthermore, the Chambéry fire itself could have played a crucial role. We know that at high temperatures, fire can alter the carbon balance in an ancient object. If the shroud absorbed modern carbon during the fire, the dating results could indicate a more recent date than the real one, producing misleading results, even if the analyzed corner did not come from the nun's restoration and was part of the original fabric. There were many reasons why the carbon-14 dating results might not be definitive. However, while this reasonable doubt did not necessarily mean that the shroud dated to the time of Christ, when news of this twist in the research reached the public, seemingly legitimizing the controversial 2022 X-ray study, speculation and fantastical stories resurfaced just as they had decades before. The doubts surrounding the 1980s dating and the inability to find a scientific explanation for the image on the shroud led many to see this as definitive proof that the Shroud of Turin was the most important relic in Christianity. Some believers and theologians propose that the image was not the result of a natural process, but of a supernatural event that occurred at the moment of Christ's resurrection, an idea that they claimed was partially supported by scientific evidence. In 2011, Italian physicist Paolo Di Lazzaro demonstrated in a laboratory that certain ultraviolet laser bursts could produce superficial images on linen with characteristics similar to those of the Shroud of Turin. However, he also stipulated that this type of energy, in the necessary amount, equivalent to 14,000 lasers striking the fabric for 40 nanoseconds, does not occur naturally on Earth, and no technology prior to the 20th century could have achieved this effect. But some believed that the power of God could. According to this hypothesis, the image of the man on the shroud was formed due to an intense burst of energy emanating from Christ's body at the moment of his resurrection, an unknown radiation of divine origin, a flash of light that imprinted his image onto the cloth, much like a photographic exposure, the very process that Di Lazzaro had proven could create the image, but generated by the power of God. Supporters of the theory believe that the Gospels provided evidence that Christ could channel such energy. The Transfiguration of Jesus is a biblical episode in which, accompanied by 3 of his disciples and atop a mountain, his face shines like the sun, and his clothing turns white as the purest light, revealing his divine nature to the apostles before the Passion. That phenomenon could have been repeated in the most significant event of the Christian faith. The image on the Shroud of Turin might have formed through that light emitted during the resurrection, similar to the luminous transfiguration on the Mount, leaving an indelible photograph on the cloth. an instant snapshot of the moment the Son of God returned to life. Although compelling and fascinating from a religious perspective, the idea that the image was formed by miraculous radiation lacked scientific backing. That flash of the resurrection had to remain within the respectable realm of faith. But the enigma had to be solved once and for all. They were aware that radiocarbon dating was not the definitive proof we had believed it to be for so many years. In terms of scientific evidence, it was just as likely that the shroud dated from the Middle Ages as from the time of Christ. And without new dating studies, without the Church granting permission to damage the shroud for further analysis, the mystery would endure. They were not going to be able to determine whether the image of that man belonged to someone contemporary to Jesus, let alone identify him as the person covered by the shroud. All they could do, having ruled out the idea of a forgery, was to find a natural process that could explain the formation of the image. Thus, they developed the theory that the image on the Shroud of Turin may have formed due to the oils and ointments used to embalm the body of Jesus or whoever was wrapped in the cloth. The Jews would wrap bodies in linen and cover them with mixtures of oils such as myrrh and aloe, as described in the Gospels, to mitigate the smell of decomposition. Some studies suggest that these oils could have interacted with sweat, blood, and other bodily fluids, generating an image either through direct contact or by oxidation of the material, in an effect similar to that of a painting or a chemical print on the fabric. The problem is that if the image had been formed by the contact with ointments and fluids, the silhouette should be deformed, distorted by the very pressure of the linen against the body. The Shroud of Turin, however, shows precise anatomical details and correct proportions, making it difficult to believe it was produced by such a mechanism. Moreover, experiments attempting to reproduce similar images using oils on ancient fabrics have not yielded the same results. It made no sense for the image to appear on the upper part of the fabric, and not on the lower side, where it was supposedly in contact with the oils. The type of discoloration in the linen was also inconsistent with liquid absorption, and although it is true that these substances could have evaporated in the fire of 1532, no traces of oils, ointments, or perfumes were found on the fabric. Too many points against it, and with another theory abandoned, only one hope remained. They had to consider one last natural process that could have generated the image on the shroud, a complex theory involving something known as the Maillard reaction, a chemical phenomenon in which sugars and amino acids react with heat, producing browning or darkening on the surface of a material. It is similar to what happens when food browns during cooking, a natural reaction that occurs in food, and also in organic tissues under certain conditions that may have come together in this event that marked the history of the Christian world. They needed sugars, amino acids, and a heat source. They knew that the Shroud of Turin had an external layer of polysaccharides, complex carbohydrates made up of a large number of simple sugars, due to the presence of starch, a substance traditionally used in the manufacturing of linen fabrics, which were soaked in a solution derived from this plant. The sugar factor was covered. At the same time, during early decomposition, a corpse releases ammonia and other nitrogenous substances through the skin. In the hours following death, more than 30 different types of amino acids emanate from the body. The second component was covered. The missing ingredient for the reaction was heat. When a body begins to decompose, there is a spike in body temperature that, in specific cases where dehydration has been involved, can exceed 40 degrees Celsius in warm and humid conditions. Theoretically, Christ suffered severe dehydration due to his time on the cross, and the tomb in which he was buried may have provided those warm and humid conditions. So, according to the theory, the amino acids emanating from his body during early decomposition reacted, thanks to the high temperature, with the sugars on the surface of the linen, creating a slight darkening of the shroud, and thus forming the image. The Maillard reaction was the only hypothesis that explained the superficial nature of the image. Remember, the image did not penetrate the deeper fibers. It was exclusively on the outermost layer of the fabric, precisely where that layer of plant sugars had been applied. It was a natural process that did not require the intervention of supernatural or inexplicable phenomena, a well-known chemical reaction, perfectly described, that would not leave residues, let alone ink or pigments on the fabric. But once again, the theory did not fully explain the sharpness and three-dimensionality of the image. If it had indeed been formed by those vapors, its contours should be diffuse, not the anatomically precise form seen on the shroud. It is also unclear whether this process could occur with enough intensity to leave a mark on linen that would remain visible for what could be over 2,000 years. The Maillard reaction provided a scientifically plausible explanation, but it did not completely solve the mystery of the image on the shroud. Everything seemed to indicate that they were back at the starting point. For many Christians, the Shroud of Turin is irrefutable proof, the cornerstone of their faith in the death and resurrection of Christ, a relic that captures the miracle of the covenant between God and humanity. For skeptics, it is an incredibly sophisticated medieval fraud or the result of a natural process that remains unsolved. Scientific evidence points to a 14th century artistic piece, yet no one has been able to explain the technique used to reproduce such a fascinating and evocative image. If someone created it, they had to be a genius capable of defying science even 700 years later. Every answer has brought new questions. Is this truly the cloth that covered the body of Jesus, or merely an object of devotion forged centuries later? Perhaps the true value of the relic does not lie in its authenticity or falseness, but in what it represents for those who gaze upon it. A symbol of faith, mystery, or controversy that has transcended time. Because beyond its origin and its history, beyond science and belief, those eyes remain fixed upon us, compelling us to wonder what lies behind that unyielding veil of shadows.